Our next speaker tonight is Isra Hussain. She's a junior from Rhode Island studying psychology with a minor in Arabic studies. Her interests are poetry and soccer, as well as coffee and talking, which she's going to be doing right now. So everyone, please give a warm welcome for Isra Hussain.
Hi everyone, I'm Isra Hussain. Thank you so much BCTalks for this opportunity to speak to you all tonight. I am going to try my best not to preach at you guys. Instead, I'd like to share my story and talk about how, as students, it's our responsibility to kind of go above and beyond what is expected of us. I'm going to start off by saying that I consider myself pretty lucky. I am one of the few people who can pinpoint exactly when their life changed, when they had a revelation, an epiphany, when they realized their calling, you could call it. However, at the same time, I really don't think I'm that lucky. The moment that I am talking about isn't something I'm proud of, and it's not something I'm especially, it's not something spectacular at all. Instead, it's a moment in 2013 when I went to Pakistan to visit my family. And for the first time in a number of years, I was reunited with a cousin I had grown up playing tag with and playing cards with in the mountains of northern Pakistan. However, when I finally was reunited with him, I was really, really excited. I looked him straight in the eyes, and he didn't look back. He didn't even recognize me. He wasn't excited. And this is when I realized how societal and cultural restraints can really negatively impact the life of someone you love. Unfortunately, my cousin, someone who has been autistic, was kicked out of school, was deprived of an education, was deprived of any institution to help him, and consequently fell into a really, really deep state of depression. His family, at the same time, was not provided the institutions or the resources in order to help their family prosper. And in a society that doesn't offer any sort of facilities for people with disabilities, especially disabilities that are more invisible, you could say, things that aren't as apparent, in this type of society, individuals have nowhere to turn. My cousins, my relatives, my friends, the children on the streets, and the men driving rickshaws, everyone is human, but at the same time, they're all deprived of this basic human right to be able to express that which really affects their life and to be able to ask for help. So growing up, I definitely did struggle being the child of immigrants, but at the same time, I had resources and privileges growing up in Rhode Island in America that my family in Pakistan didn't necessarily have. I grew up playing in my town's soccer league and playing my flute with the band in preparation for the big homecoming game. And I competed on the math team because I was kind of a nerd. And I did a lot of things. I got really involved, but at the same time, my cousin, same age as me, was deprived of a joyful childhood. And that's something I really, really struggled with. So this visit to Pakistan was the summer before my freshman year at college. I came in and I really wanted to make an impact. I wanted to do something. I didn't want to lose sight of this larger picture of the disparities I was witnessing between my life here and other children in the world. However, as you all know, you come to college and you become really absorbed in the day-to-day life. You spend all your time worrying about your next exam, about the big presentation you have, about what you're going to do that weekend, what you're going to wear for Halloween. There's so many other things on your mind. I came in and I was really, really terrified because I didn't want to lose sight of the bigger picture, and I didn't want to forget this thing that I considered my calling. So I kind of devised a plan coming into college that allowed me to turn this passion, this moment of my life that has such a huge impact on me, into concrete action. And I really tried to keep in mind the larger picture. So I came up with 5 steps that I'm hoping to share with you all right now, and then also talk about how I went about fulfilling these 5 steps. So the first step I'd like to talk about is identification of the issue. Can everyone still hear me? Great. So is identification of the issue. Of course, for me, it was this moment where I realized, everything kind of crumbled for me. I was really, really fortunate, and someone I loved and really cared about didn't have the same type of privileges I had growing up. I would like all of you to think about what does drive you. Why do you do what you do? What makes you tick? For me, it wasn't that my cousin was autistic, because of course he is an amazing human being and I loved him regardless. Instead, what made me so angry was that society didn't let him live a life that the rest of us were able to live because of this disability, something that most people can't see. And because of this, he did fall into such a deep state of depression, and the rest of his family also suffered the consequences. I was angry that he lived in a society that didn't accept mental health, that didn't accept disabilities. And I'd like to remind us all that depression is real, anxiety is real, PTSD and repercussions of psychological trauma, it's all real, and it happens to each and every one of us. This is something that I realized would affect my 4 years here, this anger, and I really wanted to act on this. Now, step number 2, I identified as being able to educate yourself onto the actual issue. For me, I didn't really know that much about mental health and about the stigma surrounding it, even on campus. I didn't know what it was like in Boston. I didn't know what it was like on a larger scale. So this says over here, I think it's really important for all of us to do our research, to kind of get involved, ask the important questions. So I started off by summer after freshman year interning at Rosie's Place, which is a women's shelter in Boston, and Suffolk County House of Corrections. And here I was doing a lot with individuals who were homeless, who were very, very poor, or who were imprisoned. And the situation here was a little different because the resources were in place for individuals to go to counseling, to be able to talk. However, a lot of what stopped individuals from seeking that help was the stigma within their culture, because a lot of the individuals I was working with were of minority religious or ethnic status. A lot of times, I talked to a woman at Rosie's Place who would tell me, I have food for my house for the next week, and I have a place to stay tonight, so I have no reason to be sad. When really they were suffering with a lot, and they really needed that outlet to talk to someone, but they didn't feel able to go and do that. The reality of the situation is that 1 in 5 adults in the US experiences mental health difficulties in a given year. If you look in this room, I'm not going to guess how many people there are in this room. I'm really bad at guessing these kind of things. But if you think about, a group of 5 people, at least one person is going to have some type of psychological trauma, some type of, mental health difficulty within a given year. At the same time, members of Rosie's Place might like to think that they're not allowed to show any type of difficulty regarding their psychological health, but an estimated 26% of homeless adults staying in shelters live with some sort of serious mental illness, most of whom don't go and get the care that they need, and it becomes a really vicious cycle. At the same time, those who I worked with at Suffolk County House of Corrections, it was a medium to high security prison. Most people also didn't go and try and seek help, talk about counseling, talk about the reasons that they had ended up in prison. And as you can see from the statistic, 24% of state prisoners have a recent history of mental health condition, again, many of which go undiagnosed and go untreated. Now, I really wanted to further this experience, so last year with my class of presidential scholars, we created a year-long social justice project, and the first event had to do with unmasking mental health, a night with the arts, where we talk about mental health in relation to arts and art therapy. We also created a documentary called The Boston State of Mind. There's a lot of advertising for that on campus last year. You can also go to bostonstateofmind.com if you're interested in checking it out. A lot of things that we discovered throughout this documentary process, this long social justice project, were things I had observed directly the summer before at Rosie's Place and at Suffolk County House of Corrections. Some of the more striking factors that do affect people in a multicultural setting are up here in the board, and the ones I would like to point out are the higher levels of stigma and the culturally insensitive healthcare system. That's one thing many of us don't think about. The medical system and the mental health systems of care here in the United States are really focused around a Western approach to medicine, when we have a growing number of minorities living in the United States, and we don't ever really think about how different cultures might view these different types of healthcare issues. Another really striking fact that I found through my research is that African Americans and Hispanic Americans use mental health services at about half the rate of Caucasians. Now, we just read a statistic that said 1 in 5 adults every year was going to face some sort of mental health condition. Knowing that only about a half of African Americans and Hispanic Americans use mental health services is super striking. At the same time, Asian Americans almost have it even worse off, and you can say that a lot of this goes with cultural stigma, also goes with the lack of culturally competent approaches to healthcare, but they use mental health services at about 1/3 the rate of Caucasian Americans. From here, I would like to go on to step number 3, which I think is really, really important, and that is becoming involved in concrete action. I know there are so many resources on campus, and there are so many different clubs and activities and ways to get involved, but I really urge each one of you to try and explore off campus. Don't get stuck in the BC bubble. Go off campus, become involved in research, find research that isn't based around Boston College, but instead looks at the larger Boston area. Look at different movements in Boston as well. What I ended up doing following the whole documentary process last year is I had these goals in mind, and I really did want to see where else I could go with this. So I applied for a research internship at the Disparities Research Unit, and that's based at Harvard Medical School, Mass General Hospital. And over there, I've been doing research with Latino immigrant mental health and its relationship with policy, with poverty, with the youth experience. Coming out of my research at Harvard, as well as Rosie's Place, Suffolk County House of Corrections, the documentary, these are some major commonalities I found underlying the past 3 years for me. I've really realized that there is a huge effect of culture, race, and minority status on someone's acceptance of mental health and someone's ability to get treatment. At the same time, there is a huge stigma, and this stigma isn't only for people who are of minority status. This stigma is looking at the larger picture and realizing how individuals separate physical health care from mental health care and psychological health care. Too often, they're seen in two completely separate realms. If you have any type of physical illness, well, that's obviously really apparent, and you're gonna go to a primary care physician. However, if you have anything that is slightly more invisible, something that you might wanna be ashamed of, just know that that's not something you should be ashamed of. It is something, that has chemically disrupted your normal train of thought. Instead of seeing everything as separate, we really should be looking at physical health and psychological health hand in hand, because psychological health informs physical health, and physical health informs psychological health. And to go along with this, there are so many statistics that show that individuals living with a serious mental illness at the same time have an increased risk of chronic medical conditions, because they really do go hand in hand. At the same time, most people don't know this, but depression is the #1 leading cause of disability worldwide. It stops people from being able to go to work, from getting an education, from being able to be productive members of society, and consequently, it causes a lot of medical conditions. Now, connecting all of this to more current events is definitely very, very important, and we have all kind of seen issues of racism and various social justice movements on campus being seen, in a lot of different current affairs if you've turned on the news recently. It's really important to connect larger issues facing society and different parts of the world. Be able to ask those questions. I've been really impressed with Doctors Without Borders, who's been doing a lot of mental health care in response to their Syrian refugee crisis. So here's a picture from a refugee camp in northern Iraq where Doctors Without Borders has set up different camps. And what I've been wondering, over the past several months, really reading about the increasing coverage of the Syrian refugee crisis, is how many people are looking at their short-term issues. Because of course those are really, really important, finding housing, finding food, finding space. But at the same time, no one's really looking at the larger picture, at the more sustainable methods, and no one's asking, what kind of trauma have these individuals gone through, and how is this gonna affect them psychologically? What can we do to help them in the long run? And I like to think that mental health is something that needs immediate attention, because if you don't get it treated, if you don't go in and ask for help, then it can have really long-term negative consequences. At the same time, there's a lot of ethical questions that go hand in hand with treatment for mental health. And a couple of examples would be the psychiatrists in Afghanistan who are treating members of the Taliban, because they see, even though these members, the psychiatrists don't necessarily agree with what they're doing, but they are still humans. And as a doctor, as someone who is in charge of healthcare, it is part of their role to treat everyone as human beings and consequently treat them for their different mental health care needs. There's some really striking statistics of Afghanistan and Pakistan, which lie really close to my heart, and this is that less than 1% of medical training is devoted to mental health in both of these countries. And what's even more alarming for me is that there is a lack of data on the prevalence of mental illness in Pakistan. There's really no numbers that tell you exactly what kind of mental illnesses or what kind of mental health issues individuals in Pakistan are facing. And this is because they live in a society in Pakistan that doesn't really give any importance to mental health care. And because of that, it can leak into different, rights for people in their education, in their future careers. It can be really, really detrimental. This is just a quote I want to throw in there from a doctor in the World Health Organization, because I really think it's so relevant. Mental health itself is never a failure. It never means you're a failure. It's no indication of a failure. It doesn't matter what culture you're coming from, what religion. At the end of the day, mental health is something that's part of the human experience. What is the failure is the fact that there are too many places that don't have institutions to care for individuals facing mental health issues. Now, I'd like to go on to the last step, which is sustainability, and looking for these solutions that are able to last a longer time. Looking at the larger picture, now that you've thought about different current events and how your life might relate to those, bringing all of that back to campus, going full circle, opening our eyes. You might not care at all about mental health, even though if you're here, I figure you probably care a little bit. But mental health is something I've decided, I've realized was my calling, is something that after seeing my cousin in Pakistan, something that I really cared about and I wanted to work towards. But again, it's not like that for everyone. Instead, I think as students, we have the responsibility to figure out what it is that drives us. And from there, work towards actual concrete steps in finding solutions for that kind of problem. We are so privileged to go to an amazing institution such as Boston College. We're getting a great Jesuit education. We have tons of resources, and we really are in the minority of the world's population in being able to get a great form of higher education. Because of that, I think it's really important for everyone to, step out of just, the more basic day-to-day work that we do experience here. And obviously, it is very stressful. Self-care is really important. Don't overwhelm yourself, but at the same time, think about the larger issues. Just some examples to throw out there. You can think about what students are doing regarding climate change on campus and kind of connected to Pope Francis's recent encyclical. You can look at systemic racism, which if anyone's turned on the news, you see what's going on in Missouri at Yale. Think about how that relates back to Boston College and how you can play a role in eradicating systemic racism. Think about gender inequality. Everyone has heard the famous BC study where it shows females have finished 4 years of college at BC and their confidence levels have decreased. Well, what does that really tell us about the larger scale issues of gender inequality? What does that tell us about media portrayal of females, about lack of rights for females throughout, on more of a global level? So again, I just wanted to remind you all about these steps I created for myself coming into college, and these are steps that I kind of lived by. I have them written in my diary. Yes, I keep a diary. And they're on the very front page, and I like reminding myself of them every day because I'm terrified that in the day-to-day craziness that is undergraduate life, I'm terrified of losing sight of the bigger picture. So again, try and identify what it is that drives you, what makes you tick. Try and educate yourself. Try and get involved in concrete action. Think about it. What can you do now that you have educated yourself to connect things to the larger issue, which brings us to current events? Turn on the news. Even though most of the time the news is really depressing and you don't really want to listen to it, try and find news that is less biased and connect things that you are passionate about here on campus to those larger images. Ask yourself those questions. And at the same time, think about sustainable solutions, because unless this generation starts thinking about sustainable solutions, we're really, really gonna have a lot of negative consequences. So again, I would just like to ask everyone, what is your cause? Finally, at a Jesuit institute, I like to think we can finally become men and women for others. And I'd just like to end on a quote by a Jesuit that I greatly admire, Father Dean Brackley. And he wrote this after visiting Central America, but I like to think this quote applies to really anything. The quote is, "Hopefully your heart is broken, you fall in love, your worldview crumbles, and you're ruined for life." And I really hope everyone in this room finds something and actively seeks out something that does break your heart and crumbles your worldview. And I'm not trying to be very pessimistic right now, but I just think it's important to have your worldview crumbled. Thank you.